I'm Austin Westfall. Let's check in, as we do on Saturdays, with the AP's Will Weissert. He covers the White House for the Associated Press. You know, top of the hour, we were airing that press gaggle that President Trump had aboard Air Force One. We've been kind of looking to see how the U.S. would address a direct question about that strike on a girls' school, that strike that happened basically in the opening moments of the U.S.'s campaign in Iran. Will, the president, saying that he believes that it was an Iranian missile that caused that. The AP and a number of other news outlets have done some reporting and have come to a different conclusion. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's right. It's looking more and more likely, we don't know definitively, but that the U.S. was probably not Israel. The U.S. was probably behind this strike that hit the school. The president just suggested differently. He said that Iran was behind this and that they were not very accurate with their firing of missiles and their munitions. But even in the moment there, he was with Hegseth and Steve Witkoff, and there was some sort of hemming and hawing, and Hegseth said they were still sort of investigating. So I think it's still very much up in the air. But yes, our reporting is it's looking more and more likely that there was a girls' school struck, and it was a U.S. strike that did it.
Ultimately, this was pretty much, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe this was the first extended Q&A that the press has been able to do, largely focused on this conflict. He has answered questions from the press sporadically throughout the week, but this was really about a 15-minute long back and forth on nothing but the Middle East. What else stood out to you? He was asked about the Kurds. That's another thing that a lot of people have questions about, is what's the likelihood that some type of group from within might be able to overtake the Iranian regime? What stuck out to you about what Trump was saying about the Kurds?
Right. He was pretty definitive there. He sort of said he made up his mind. He didn't want support from the Kurds, right? Which certainly seemed like a possibility. Still could be going forward. But he was more clear on that issue than he has been. And as you say, he's talked about this a couple times throughout the last few days. But this was the first sort of extended comments that we've had. His tone was very sober because he was coming from the dignified transfer in Delaware. For the service members that were killed, the American service members that were killed. But he made a lot of news, I think, in that gaggle. He also talked about the UK and the possibility that they might send aircraft carriers, and he was sort of very dismissive about it, right? He said, wow, that would have been nice a couple weeks ago, but I don't really care sort of what they do. He talked about Russia. AP and others are reporting that the Russians are sharing intelligence, right, with Iran and maybe helping them strike American forces in certain areas. The President Trump mentioned, he said, he didn't have any evidence of that happening, and that if it was happening, it wasn't very good intelligence because, Iran hadn't been able to strike sort of very much. But, the interesting thing about that answer was he didn't rule it out, right? He didn't say, no, this is not happening. When he said, well, if it is happening, it's not making much of an effect, which is a very different sort of answer. He talked about boots on the ground, right? The boots on the ground questions have sort of been all over the place. And they've sort of hit on a message now more recently in the last couple of days where they say, where the president will say and the administration will say, we could see American forces on the ground. They're not ready to sort of do it now, but he's not ruling it out, and he doesn't want to sort of take that, card off the table. Doesn't want to maybe tip his cards, right? To put it in another metaphor. That's another thing, of course, that everyone is very, very interested in and still remains sort of very, very much up in the air. There was lots of sort of answers that were quite interesting, in the sort of extended Q&A there.
Yeah, this is what the president posted. He alluded to this during that gaggle. He said, I think my post says basically what I want to say. Here's the post he was alluding to. The United Kingdom, our once great ally, maybe the greatest of them all, is finally giving serious thought to sending 2 aircraft carriers to the Middle East. That's okay, Prime Minister Starmer. We don't need them any longer, but we will remember. We don't need people that join wars after we've already won. Is this the first time we've heard the president say that we have won the war?
That might be the first time he's been as definitive. He's been saying, for several days that he thinks it's going very well. He uses language going back to last summer about obliterating their nuclear capabilities. So, sort of the sanguine language, optimistic language, and putting it in very sort of strident tones is not new. I'm not sure he said before that they actually sort of, won the war. I think the reality on the ground is quite a bit more complicated than that. Is the conflict, it seems like it's already spilling into other parts of the region, right? But, this is not a president who's going to sort of shy away from declaring victory, even before it's clear that it's at hand.
You know, we were playing these remarks moments ago. President Trump gathering with regional leaders in Florida at what he called the Shield of the Americas summit, where he encouraged them to take military action against drug trafficking cartels and transnational gangs that he says pose an unacceptable threat to the hemisphere's national security. So, Will, not only focusing on the Middle East today, but the president also having this high-profile event focusing on the Americas. How consequential does this summit feel in today's context?
Well, I think under normal circumstances, it would be quite confident, quite a big deal. I guess we could put it that way. This is a meeting of the region. He was really putting a lot of pressure on Latin American leaders to use the military to help crack down on cartels and people smugglers and drug smugglers. Those are all sort of big headlines. In the context of what's going on, in Iran and the larger Middle East, it's getting overshadowed, and I think he's aware of that, right? I mean, he made time in between going to Delaware for the sort of somber ceremony, and the other things he's doing this weekend to go and address the summit. They're having it at Doral, right, which shows that it's an important issue for him. This is another chance for him to sort of talk up the Don Roe doctrine, right, and the idea that the U.S. is really going to sort of insert itself more into regional affairs, especially when it comes to things like cracking down on drugs and being willing to sort of lean on the military. But obviously that this is something that even though he's working on, he's got a lot of things going on, and it is sort of getting overshadowed, I think, by what's going on in Iran. The other piece of this, of course, is it's been a tough week on a lot of sort of fronts, right? We've seen the gas prices go up. That was something they spent months talking about. They were very excited about what the administration said was Trump's policies helping give people relief at the pump. That's no longer true, right? The war has driven prices up, and analysts say they could go as high as $150 a barrel of oil. Which would be quite a bit more economic pain here. The stock market was once at record highs. It's been affected by the conflict as well. And we had the jobs report on Friday that showed that the country actually shedding jobs. So all of these economic messages are intertwined. Again, that is also going to sort of compete for attention with what's going on in Florida and the LATAM summit. And it's hard to imagine that the economy wouldn't sort of win that attention battle.
This is President Trump getting off the plane earlier today in Delaware. The president, some people might be at home thinking, wait, the president was in Florida and in Delaware today? Yes, he was. And then back down to Florida after Delaware. So he was at that summit in southern Florida, and then he did go up to the dignified transfer. Today we saw the dignified transfer, as you noted, for the 6 U.S. soldiers killed in the war in the Middle East. It happened at Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. President Trump saying earlier in the day that the fallen service members were heroes coming home in a different manner than they thought they'd be coming home. He said it was a very sad situation, and he pledged to keep American war deaths to a minimum. We're now a week into the war, and CENTCOM says they're not slowing their campaign against Iran. Will, what have you been tracking as far as the president's busy weekend? I mean, we've been talking about the war itself, but this was a pretty big priority for the president to go up to Delaware in the middle of his Florida trip.
It was, I think that affected how much time he spent at the Latin American summit, right? These are all leaders that all gathered for this meeting. It was, potentially going to be several hours all day. Instead, he came in, he gave a speech this morning, and then he immediately flew to Delaware and is now sort of making his way back. I think that just reflects, the sort of changing priorities with what's going on in Iran and how that's sort of overshadowing a lot of the other work being done.
Lastly, one thing, a live look at the White House, by the way, approaching 5:30 in the nation's capital. I've kind of just been looking out for reactions from the Trump administration from every direction I could possibly find. We've been watching for statements from Secretary Hegseth on the daily, from President Trump, of course, on the daily, General Kane, Admiral Cooper. Has it seemed like Vice President Vance has sort of taken at least a small step back from the spotlight this week?
I think that's fair to say. Maybe we could say he hasn't necessarily had a major, public profile in the last week, right? He did an interview on Fox News, a sort of a brief one with a friendly interviewer. I should say the questions were largely pretty friendly, and he, like any good vice president will do, defended the administration, defended policy in Iran. But the vice president is somebody who built his political career around America First policies, and a lot of that had to do with really isolationism. nationalism, right? I mean, his whole sort of argument was he didn't want to get involved in regime change. He didn't want to get involved in forever wars. You know, he'd rather have the U.S. worry about domestic issues and sort of settling things back home before we go around the world and start all these other, you know, fights. And that's difficult, right? Because that's sort of exactly what we're seeing. You know, things like regime change are suddenly no longer foreboding, right? Depends on what day you sort of catch President Trump, but he's warmed to the idea quite a bit. And I think that is deeply sort of controversial and can cause some conflict within the vice president as a person, and that's maybe why you're not seeing him quite so publicly. That said, he has been involved in national security discussions about this. He was involved last weekend, from afar when the attacks were first happening. And he's certainly not been critical of it. But the sort of personal struggle that he's having, I think, is something we've seen within the MAGA movement writ large, right? There are a lot of folks that say, we're America first, and we voted for Trump because we didn't want these kinds of wars, right? And now here we are in Iran, and we could see it escalate into other parts of the Middle East. Trump says he's MAGA, right? And he knows what MAGA wants because he's the founder, and they'll sort of follow him wherever he goes. That's certainly been true. There's been internal strife in the MAGA movement before, and he's always been able to, sort of remain very much in command of it and be the leader of the movement. So I'm not predicting that that's going to be something that is going to fracture and we can't see it be brought back together. But I do think that this is a real moment of sort of political challenge, and I think that the vice president, frankly, is sort of embodying some of that as a person and as an elected official.
Will Weissert covers the White House for the AP. Good to see you, Will. Thanks.